Hello everyone and welcome to Game Intus. I will be your host, Andrew from Beta 64, that show about game development, and today's episode will be on a very convoluted history of early Nintendo emulation. The history of emulation in general has been often misconstrued and undocumented. The subgenre of then obsolete games being put on more advanced hardware has been a thing since the early 1990s, with Dutch computer users translating Japan-only games to PC and black box NES ROMs such as Donkey Kong being converted to the FM towns. However, emulation wasn't always as popular as it was. Its popularity only started around 1995 to 1997, mostly due to the increased CPU speed of computers and the increased usage of internet in households. Emulators weren't always as good as they are today. Just like anything, it all had to start from somewhere, and this is the story of early Nintendo emulation.
What's it like to play the Nintendo Entertainment System? Nintendo Entertainment System. Now you're playing with power.
It all started on a Japanese personal computer called FM Towns. The FM Towns was a variant of PC meant mostly for computer games and multimedia applications. In December of 1990, a programmer by the name of Haruhisa Utagawa released the first ever Nintendo emulator for the FM Towns, titled simply Family Computer Emulator. It was the first of its kind, while being limited only to run certain very simple Mapper Zero Famicom games like Donkey Kong. It paved the way for the future of Nintendo emulation as a whole. Following Utagawa's work, Nobuaki Ando wrote and released their own Famicom emulator called Pasofami for the FM Towns in 1993. In 1995, he released a Windows version to go along with the FM Towns version. The Pasofami emulator had many improvements over the Family Computer emulator, like being able to run more games. Despite its improvements, it still fell flat on a few things like sound emulation. The biggest downside of the emulator was that it was a paid ordeal. Interestingly, this was normal back in the day. It isn't frowned upon like it is today. After both the Family Computer emulator and the Pasofami, 3 new emulators followed them. The first one being Landy NES by Alex Krzyzewski. Landy NES has very little information surrounding it, as it only had one beta version that was ever released to the public. No real release date is known, but it's said to have released somewhere around the mid-90s. Following Landy NES, Murat Fazulin released iNES in 1996. This is where the iNES headers originated. Many of you would be familiar with the iNES header from the recent debates on whether Nintendo downloaded the Virtual Console ROMs from the internet, but that's misinformation. It's said that someone who worked on the iNES went to work for Nintendo, but I digress. Fazulin had worked on Krzyzewski's Landy NES before using it as a base for the iNES, but iNES was still a fully fledged emulator that again improved on a lot of things that were at fault in prior emulators. One small quirk about the emulator is that the sound was a paid feature. In 1996, British programmer Paul Robson released the NES-A to the public. Along with the whole program being free, Robson also released the source code to the public, which hadn't been done prior to this. Very cool, Robson. Thank you.
For those of you who miss your Nintendo Entertainment System, not to worry. The games you once had for this are being brought back to life.
Metroid, Castlevania 2, and Bionic Commando. The games you and I grew up playing are available for downloading off the internet. Thanks to a program called NESticle, a Nintendo emulator for your home PC, which is like taking the information out of the system itself and transferring it straight to your home computer.
Meet Isa Addis. His talent in computing had gotten him the acclaim of most likely to be millionaire in his class of 1994. Despite these accolades presented to him, Isa was also seen as an outcast at the school, often known for his bizarre and sometimes disturbed sense of humour. This did bring the interest of one student, however, 2 years prior, and his name was Ethan Petty, quickly becoming best friends with Isa in his later high school years. Along with their shared knack of a warped sense of humour, Ethan and Isa had also shared a scent of hatred amongst the recent controversies over video game violence caused by games such as Night Trap and Mortal Kombat. With Ethan on graphics and Isa on code, the two had founded their own independent game group in 1992 to make their own purposely disturbing games to mock the situation. They had to come up with a name for their company. After a quick discussion, the name had been chosen: Bloodlust Software. Between November and December of that year, 3 games were all planned and developed to help the group grow: Malachi Must Die, The Inferno, and Executioners. Sadly, only Executioners, a beat-em-up in the style of games like Final Fight, saw the light of day, while the other 2 had been shelved. The reception of Executioners had been overall positive, most notably in the local area of Wichita. According to one classmate of Ethan and Isa, their response was, quote, a bit demented, but impressive for a local person, after downloading a game from a BBS board. A Bloodlust game was clearly a Bloodlust game. Some people thought it was visual torture. I was with the second group, but hey, we had to keep creating, it was what we loved. Ethan Petty. More games were submitted to shareware and BBS boards over time, such as the more popular Noggin Knockers and Time Slaughter. With the release of more successful games, Bloodlust expanded into more than just shareware games, with homemade songs performed by Ethan, desktop screensavers, and most importantly, emulation. It is unknown as to when and how Ethan and Isa started the development on their ambitious emulation project, but it ended up dissolved into NESticle, which hit the freeware market in April of 1997. A blood-spewing hand guides your way through NESticle's simple dark blue interface, which features many different input devices, emulation options, and other random features expected in any standard emulator. The only thing that differed NESticle from the other emulators, however, was its humour. Bloodlust's in-house grotesque characters were included in the emulator, which added a flair of humour to the page. First, there was Buddy, a mentally handicapped teenager inspired by a drunken impression of the character Corky from Life Goes On. Later was the more popular Shitlord, a sentient pile of poo that was deemed as the mascot of the emulator. The success of the emulator has been heavily prominent, with NESticle reaching minor status into the mainstream with pleased reception across the web. This immediately piqued the interest of many people in the growing cracking community, one of whom was a man named Donald Moore. In early 1997, an anonymous woman from Arizona filed for divorce against a man named Donald Moore, the leader of a notorious international cracking group known as Damaged Cybernetics. She spilled her guts to her lawyer, claiming he had hacked MTV.com, Cupped.com, Sega.com, monitored Marat Faizulin's every activity for 3 years, and stole hundreds of millions of dollars of confidential information belonging to corporations that was obtained from using the internet. Despite all of these allegations, Moore still pleaded not guilty. Some see this as a tactic by his ex to take his kids. Donald had recently left a 3-year sentence in jail that year, and had gotten into the emulation scene after his divorce under the name MindRape. He was well aware about Bloodlust and personally knew some of the people within their group. So much so that on April 8th, 1997, 5 days after NESticle was released, he managed to hack into Isa's, then known as Sardu, account and openly leak the source code to NESticle. Quote, Sardu was running Windows 95 at the time. He made the mistake of leaving drive sharing on, which should not have been on by default, but for some reason it was on. MindRape was then able to mount Sardu's hard drive, since drive sharing was enabled, with Samba. Pretty clever, right? Regardless, he did this, and not only was he able to retrieve the NESticle source code, he was able to look through all of his drives, his zip drive, his hard drive, his CD-ROM drive, whatever he wanted. Brad Levikoff, creator of Zophar's domain. MindRape leaked the source code online under the file name cronksource.zip that year. Isa also went by the username Kronk. And obviously Isa did not take the situation calmly. Isa reported on a Usenet post about the event, and that NESticle had been discontinued before the final version was released. Luckily, Scyhh changed his word on the discontinuation about a month after the incident, and in the year or so afterwards, he returned to emulators and finally finished NESticle, along with Genesis, a Sega Genesis emulator by Scyhh, in 1998. David Moore was never forgiven for the leaks of the NESticle source code, but many believe he is the one to thank for the MP3 format's popularity, and for the first public NES ROM dumper, for which he made the schematic available to the public. An SNES emulator by the name of NESticle went unreleased out of Scyhh's anger from the leak. In the July 1998 version of NESticle, Scyhh bluntly tells the user, quote, not to ask about NESticle.
Hey, that was pretty cool. You want to know more about the cool accessories? Like the Mario paints, maybe? Check this out, huh? Oh, you know, how about the Super NES Super Score, All right, boys, let's see a Terminator do that, huh? Okie dokie, just press the buttons and get it all on Nintendo Power Previews. Now, check this out.
The year is 1994, the Super Nintendo is the hip new system, and you're looking for another way to get your hands on it. What if there was another way you could play SNES games? This very year, the first Super Nintendo emulator was born. VSMC was a small-scale emulator that could only run a handful of homebrew titles, but was later updated to support some commercial games. This was the start of the SNES emulator scene. In 1996, Nobuaki Ando returned to the emulation scene with his new emulator appropriately named Super Pasofami. It is said that Ando was racist. In specific versions of Super Pasofami, the program would delete the Windows directory of English installations of Windows. Biyu, a prominent SNES developer, mentions that there was a version of Super Pasofami that would all over the Windows installation if it wasn't a Japanese version, or something equally insane. After Super Pasofami, an emulator called Super Virtual Wildcard was written and released by Ernesto Corvi. This is considered to be one of the first good Super Nintendo emulators. In 1996, there were two prominent projects in the scene known as SNES 96 and SNES 97. Both merged to create a very well-known emulator called SNES 9X. In 1997, two users by the names of Lord ESNES and Ishmael released their emulator, called ESNES. It was one of the first emulators to have sound emulation thanks to Ishmael's efforts. Later, the project merged with another emulator called NLK SNES, which was one of the best and fastest emulators out at the time, despite it lacking sound emulation. The merged projects ended up as NLKE, which was the best of both worlds, containing the speed of NLK SNES and the sound of ESNES. Following all of these emulators, another very popular emulator was released by developers ZS Knight, Demo, Page Fault, and Notch. The emulator was called ZSNES. The developer's main focus this time around was speed over accuracy, so there were many visual glitches and many games didn't work at all. Fast forwarding to 2004, a person by the name of Biyu started development on the most accurate SNES emulator entitled BSNES. Development continued all throughout the years until March of 2020 when Biyu retired from development. The source is now maintained by the community. Jumping back to the topic of Scyhh Addis, he is credited for his work in many games, but one specifically stands out: Scyhh's work on Fight Night Round 2 for the Nintendo GameCube. Inside of Fight Night Round 2 is an included playable version of Super Punch-Out for the Super Nintendo. If one digs into the game's code to look at the emulator that plays Super Punch-Out, it is entitled NESticle, the fabled SNES emulator that in July of 1998, Scyhh asked users to completely forget about.
And with an eye to the future, tomorrow begins today. Nintendo, the world's leader in video games, has joined forces with Silicon Graphics, the world's leader in visual computing, to introduce the most exhilarating, breathtakingly realistic 3D video entertainment ever witnessed. Project Reality. Leagues beyond any currently available or anticipated hardware, Project Reality will bring to home video players the same types of astounding visual effects seen in movies, like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park. When this technology is made interactive, players won't just watch their TV screens, they'll dive headfirst right through them.
The Nintendo 64, formerly known as the Ultra 64 and Project Reality, ushered in a groundbreaking new era for console and Nintendo enthusiasts. It was our first look into an affordable 3D console. Featuring graphics that some have compared to CGI movies like Toy Story, the Nintendo 64 was home to many games like Super Mario 64, Wave Race, GoldenEye 007, and loads more. Still, the burning question that remained in many people's minds, what if there was another way to play these games besides buying a console? Meet Project Unreality, first released in 1998 by developer Michael Tedder. Project Unreality proved that Nintendo 64 emulation was possible, and that it will become more widely available in the future with some hard work and dedication. While it was still a basic emulator, it pulled off a few impressive feats like running various fan-made Nintendo 64 demos, as well as actually booting to the N64 screens of games like Wave Race 64 and the Mortal Kombat trilogy. However, the development of Project Unreality was later cancelled due to the developer being hired to work on commercial video games. Then, about a year later, on January 26, 1999, Ultra HLE was released to the public by developers Reality Man and Epsilon. This was the first emulator to utilize a tactic called high-level emulation, HLE, which is essentially the recreation of a system you're emulating. Basically, instead of directly emulating the system, you're recreating its functionality. The emulation was so good, in fact, that Nintendo themselves caught on, and they weren't happy. They sued not even a month after the emulator's release. I quote, "Nintendo is very disturbed that Reality Man and Epsilon have widely distributed a product designed solely to play infringing copies of copyrighted works. We are taking several measures to further protect and enforce our intellectual property rights, which, of course, includes the bringing of legal action. Emulators and ROMs are clearly infringing and damage not only larger industry players, such as Nintendo, but hundreds of smaller companies who invest millions of dollars and thousands of hours to develop and program software only to have it stolen on the internet." End quote. Then, sometime in 1999, arguably one of the biggest things to happen to Nintendo 64 emulation had occurred, and many refer to this as the Nintendo 64 scene's dirty little secret. A user going by the name of Oman joined the Nintendo 64 development IRC chat room. Oman explained that he was an employee at SGI, or Silicon Graphics Incorporated, the company that partnered with Nintendo to create the N64. At first, the users in the chat room were scared and thought Oman was there to collect information on the users to shut down their efforts. Little did they know, he was actually on their side. Days later, Oman started to slowly FTP files over to the users. The files contained a plethora of things like hardware information, software development kits, and more. This was all, of course, highly illegal. Following these events, SGI caught on and had called Oman, requesting to see him immediately. Oman knew he was up and alerted the Nintendo 64 development IRC. Eventually he fled and may or may not have been caught. And the users who still did have the archive rushed to delete the files to stay out of legal trouble. To this day, only about half of the archive that has been given to the members of this IRC survives in safe hands. However, the leak that happened on May 1st, 2020 contained an updated version of the Oman archive, with newer files that we initially got from the leak in 1999. Since the initial drop of the Oman archive, many Nintendo 64 developers were using these illegal files to aid emulation, which is what made many emulators illegal. However, it is hard to tell who exactly is using these files. Then, in the year 2000, NEMU64 was released by developers Lack and Lemmy. This was the first Nintendo 64 emulator to use the plugins system prominent in a few Nintendo 64 emulators today, mainly Project 64 and earlier versions of Mupen 64. Although it's an older emulator, Nemu is applauded for having extensive debugging features that are not present in many Nintendo 64 emulators today. Even ROM hacker and developer Keiza Manuar used Nemu extensively for debugging and programming his ROM hacks. Nemu 64 essentially paved the way for all future Nintendo 64 emulators from this point, and it completely changed the atmosphere of the scene.